The gasp from the crowd was like a physical blow, but Lady Charlotte Pembroke didn't flinch. Her eyes, burning with a righteous fire, were locked on the cold, impassive face of Duke Edward Loxley, the man who had destroyed her world. His name was a curse on her lips, a poison in her heart. She saw not a man, but a vulture who had feasted on her family's ruin. She didn't know he was the only thing standing between her and a far greater evil. She didn't know that this single moment of public defiance would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel a conspiracy, reaching the highest echelons of power, forcing her to question everything she believed and risk her own honor to save the man she had vowed to destroy. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The afternoon light that filtered through the tall, grimy windows of Blackwood Manor was weak and apologetic, illuminating a world of faded grandeur. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of sun, tracing lazy patterns over the threadbare Aubusson carpet and the bare, discolored rectangles on the silk-paneled walls where generations of Pembroke portraits had once hung. A persistent chill, the kind that seeps deep into the bones, clung to the air, a constant reminder of the many fireplaces that now sat cold and empty. In the center of this grand decay, Lady Charlotte Pembroke stood as a solitary figure of defiance. Her back was ramrod straight, her chin held at an angle of unbreakable pride as she polished a silver candelabra, one of the few remaining pieces of a once vast collection. The rhythmic motion was a small act of rebellion against the ruin that threatened to consume them, a testament to her refusal to surrender to despair. She was reviewing the household accounts in her head, a grim and repetitive task that had become her daily ritual. The numbers swam before her eyes, a relentless tide of debt and deficit. With a sigh that felt torn from the very depths of her soul, she made another painful calculation, another sacrifice on the altar of their dwindling solvency. Her mother's cherished Meissen porcelain figurines, the delicate shepherdesses and gallant musicians that had once danced along the mantelpiece, would have to be sold. The decision settled like a stone in her stomach, heavy and cold. "Do you ever miss it, Charlotte?" The voice, soft and wistful, startled her. Her younger sister, Anne, had drifted into the room, a ghost of their former life in a simple muslin dress. She was more delicate than Charlotte, with a romantic air and wide, innocent eyes that still held a flicker of hope, a quality Charlotte feared she herself had lost forever. "The music," Anne continued, her gaze distant. "The dancing, the feeling that anything could happen." Charlotte's hand stilled on the silver. She felt a bitter internal scoff rise in her throat. The London season. It felt like a cruel joke now, a glittering, frivolous world where their family name, Pembroke, was no longer spoken with respect, but whispered with a mixture of pity and scorn. Her thoughts, as they so often did, turned to the architect of their downfall, Duke Edward Loxley. The memory of his face was seared into her mind, a portrait of cold, aristocratic indifference. She could still see him at the final meeting, his expression unreadable, his presence an immense, suffocating weight in the room as he impassively acquired the last of their crippling debts. Her hatred for him was a palpable force, a dark, solid thing in the crumbling edifice of her world. It was the fire that kept the chill at bay. "We have more important things to concern ourselves with than dancing," Charlotte said, her tone sharper than she intended, a brittle shield for the raw pain beneath. She could not, would not, let Anne see the true depth of their despair. She carried the burden for them both. The next morning was as dreary as their prospects. A persistent drizzle wept down the window panes of the morning room, blurring the view of the overgrown gardens. A footman, one of only 3 servants they had left, brought in the mail on a tarnished silver tray. Among the bills and circulars was a single thick cream envelope, sealed with the impressive crest of the Duchess of Hartsworth. An invitation. Anne's eyes, which had been clouded with the same gloom that filled the house, suddenly lit up. "The Hartsworth ball," she breathed, her fingers tracing the elegant calligraphy. "It's the one invitation we still receive. Oh, Charlotte, we must go." Charlotte's immediate reaction was a visceral refusal. The thought of it was a physical torment. To face society, to stand in a room filled with the very people who now gossiped about their ruin, to endure their pitying looks and hushed whispers, was more than she could bear. And worse, infinitely worse, she knew times would be there. Duke Loxley was a fixture at such events, a powerful solitary figure who moved through the highest echelons of society with an assurance that infuriated her. The idea of breathing the same air as him, of being in the same room, made her feel physically ill. "Please, Charlotte," Anne begged, her voice trembling with a desperate hope that twisted Charlotte's heart. "Just for one night. I want to feel like a lady again, not a ghost in our own home." "And be paraded like a tragedy?" Charlotte retorted, the words tasting like ash. "To have everyone stare and whisper about the poor Pembrokes, and to see times him asterisk." She didn't need to say Loxley's name. It hung in the air between them, a toxic miasma. She looked away from her sister, her jaw tight with internal conflict. A part of her, the fiercely protective part, wanted to lock the doors and shield Anne from the world's casual cruelty forever. But another part, the part that was so utterly exhausted by the constant fight, wavered. She looked back at her sister's face, at the pleading hope in her eyes, and felt her own resolve begin to crack. Her duty to Anne, her desire to give her even a single night of happiness, was at war with her pride and her profound, consuming hatred. Weeks later, Charlotte found herself navigating the glittering, crowded ballroom of Hartsworth House, a reluctant ship in a sea of silk, jewels, and stifling perfume. The overwhelming sound of the orchestra, the scent of beeswax, and 1,000 competing floral scents, the dazzling fractured light from a dozen massive chandeliers, it was all a sensory assault. She had relented, of course. Anne's happiness had won out over her own misery. Now, she endured it, her face a mask of icy indifference, her gloved hand resting lightly on Anne's arm. She could feel the whispers like insects crawling on her skin, see the sideways glances and the sudden, feigned interest in a tapestry or a floral arrangement when she met someone's gaze. "Lady Charlotte." A smooth, oily voice slid into her ear. She turned to find Lord Harrington, a suave, older nobleman with a reputation for being as charming as he was. "Ruthless," he bowed, his eyes lingering on her with an overly sympathetic gleam that felt entirely insincere. "A terrible business. What happened to your father? A true gentleman, but alas, not a man for these modern, ruthless times." The words were a string of veiled insults, each one a tiny, poisoned dart. He was calling her father weak, a relic. Charlotte's spine stiffened. "My father was a man of honor, Lord Harrington, a quality that never goes out of fashion." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course. He was about to say more when a subtle shift occurred in the crowd. A space cleared, a path opened. Across the room she saw him. Duke Edward Loxley stood alone, a commanding, solitary figure in immaculate black evening wear. He was observing the room with that same unreadable expression she so despised, a look of detached assessment that made her feel like he was cataloguing the worth of every person present. His presence was immense, a gravitational pull that drew the eye and silenced the air around him. Her hatred, which had been a low simmer, began to boil. Later, as Anne was swept into a dance by a young, eager Viscount, Charlotte found herself cornered near the French doors leading to the terrace. And then he was there. Duke Loxley approached, and the small group she had been pretending to converse with simply melted away. "Lady Charlotte," he said. His voice was a low, formal baritone, devoid of any discernible emotion. "I am surprised to see you here." Was that a challenge? A taunt? She met his cool grey eyes without flinching. "And I am surprised you have the audacity to speak to me, Your Grace." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, crossed his features before his stoic mask settled back into place. He looked at her, at the proud set of her shoulders, the defiant tilt of her chin, the fire in her eyes that she knew must be blazing. "Your pride is as formidable as ever," he remarked. Perhaps he intended it as a compliment, a grudging acknowledgement of her resilience. But she did not hear it that way. She heard it as a mockery of her fallen state, a cruel jab at the only thing she had left. It was the trigger. The dam of her carefully constructed composure, strained by weeks of silent suffering and the humiliation of this night, finally burst. All the pent-up fury, the grief, the suffocating sense of injustice, erupted. "My pride is all my family has left, Your Grace," she declared, her voice ringing out sharp and clear in a sudden lull in the music. The orchestra faltered. Heads turned. Everyone was watching. "It is a concept you know nothing about. You build your fortune on the ruins of honorable men." His face remained a mask of stone, which only fueled her rage. She saw the shock on the faces around them, the delight of the gossips, the scandalized horror of the Duchess. She didn't care. She raised her hand, the instinct to strike him, to leave a physical mark on that impassive face, overwhelming her. But at the last moment, she froze. The act was too coarse, too common, a betrayal of the very breeding she was defending. Her hand trembled in the air for a heartbeat before she slowly, deliberately lowered it. Instead, she drew herself up to her full height and delivered a final, scathing volley. "May you enjoy the wealth you have so dishonorably gained." With that, she turned on her heel, her borrowed silk gown sweeping around her, and marched from the ballroom. She did not look back, but she could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her and the heavy, unmoving gaze of the Duke. She left behind a stunned, absolute silence, and in its center, the stoic, solitary man she had just publicly branded a villain. The days that followed the Hartsworth ball were a blur of defiant solitude. Charlotte had expected repercussions, a flurry of cancelled invitations, and the cold shoulders of former acquaintances. What she received was far worse, a suffocating silence. It seemed her public outburst had rendered her not just a pariah, but a ghost, a cautionary tale to be avoided at all costs. The isolation, however, did not bring peace. It only gave her more time to replay the scene in her mind, to feel the phantom sting of the slap she never delivered, and to stoke the embers of her hatred for Duke Loxley. It was this grim preoccupation that led her, a week later, to the dusty, book-lined offices of Mr. Davies, the Pembroke family's solicitor for over 40 years. She told herself the visit was a practical necessity. Another asset, a small parcel of land on the far side of the county, had to be sold to cover their immediate expenses. But as she sat in the worn leather chair opposite Mr. Davies's cluttered desk, the air thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax, she knew she was also seeking a kind of validation. She wanted to hear him condemn Loxley, to affirm that her righteous anger was justified. Mr. Davies, a cautious, meticulous man with kind eyes clouded by worry, did not oblige. He peered at her over the top of his spectacles, his fingers steepled, his expression grave. "I heard about the incident at the ball, Lady Charlotte," he began, his voice a low rumble. "It was unwise. A man like Duke Loxley is not one to be made a public enemy of. His power is considerable, his reach extensive." "His power was built on the wreckage of my family," Charlotte countered, her voice tight. "I will not be silent in the face of such villainy." "Villainy is a strong word," Mr. Davies murmured, shifting a stack of papers. "And in this case, perhaps a premature one." He pulled a thick folio from the stack, its cover tied with a faded ribbon. "I have taken the liberty of reviewing the foreclosure documents again. All of them." He untied the ribbon and spread the papers on the desk. "It was all perfectly legal, Lady Charlotte, impeccably so, almost too perfect." He tapped a long, bony finger on a specific ledger entry. "The timing, the execution. It was as if the Duke was waiting for the precise moment of your father's maximum vulnerability. That part is cold, I grant you. But this," he slid the paper closer to her, "this is what I find most peculiar." Charlotte leaned forward, her eyes scanning the columns of figures. She was no stranger to these numbers. She had wept over them for months. But Davies was pointing to the final sum, the amount paid by Loxley to consolidate the various loans from a dozen different creditors. "He paid significantly, more times than the outstanding debt," the solicitor said softly. "Nearly 20% more. It was not the action of a man merely seeking a profit from a distressed property. It was an acquisition. He wasn't just settling a debt, my lady. He was buying out every other interested party and paying a premium to do so." Charlotte stared at the number, her mind refusing to process its implication. It made no sense. Why would a predator pay more than his prey was worth? Why would a vulture pay for a carcass? Mr. Davies seemed to read her thoughts. "A vulture picks a carcass clean, my lady," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He does not pay for the privilege of doing so. I do not know the Duke's motives, but they are not as simple as you believe. I urge you to be cautious. The story may be more complex than it appears." Charlotte left the solicitor's office in a state of profound turmoil. She wanted to dismiss his words, to cling to the simple, satisfying narrative of her hatred. It was a shield, a fortress she had built around her broken heart, and she was reluctant to lower it. Yet, the detail about him overpaying was a dissonant note in the symphony of her rage. It was a fact, cold and hard, and it refused to be ignored. For the first time since her father's death, a tiny hairline crack appeared in the foundation of her certainty, and the feeling was not liberating, but terrifying. To escape the suffocating confines of the manor, and the even more suffocating confines of her own thoughts, Charlotte went for a ride. The windswept moors that bordered the Blackwood estate had always been her sanctuary, a place of wild, untamed beauty where the howl of the wind could drown out the whispers of her own mind. She urged her mare, a spirited grey named Zephyr, into a gallop, the cold air stinging her cheeks, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the turf, a balm to her frayed nerves. She rode for over an hour, pushing deeper into the rolling hills until the manor was but a distant grey smudge against the horizon. It was near an old stone marker, a weathered obelisk that delineated the northernmost edge of the Pembroke lands, that she saw them. Two men, their coats flapping in the wind, were hunched over a tripod topped with a brass surveying instrument. They did not belong here. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in her stomach. She slowed Zephyr to a walk, approaching them silently over the soft ground. "This is private land," she announced, her voice carrying clearly on the wind. "By what right are you here?" The men started, whirling around in surprise. They were rough-looking, their faces weathered and unfamiliar. The taller one, who seemed to be in charge, quickly composed himself, doffing his cap with a clumsy gesture. "Beg pardon, milady," he said, his voice gruff. "Just a routine assessment for the county, mapping the old boundaries." His lie was too quick, too smooth. "The county has maps of these boundaries that are centuries old," Charlotte replied, her gaze unwavering. "I will ask you again. Who sent you?" The men exchanged a nervous glance. The shorter one, clearly more flustered, stammered, "Lord Harrington just wanted a lay of the land for a potential." He stopped abruptly as his partner shot him a furious glare. Harrington. The name landed like a stone in the churning waters of her confusion. Lord Harrington, the man with the oily smile and the insincere condolences at the ball. Why would he be surveying her land? "You will pack your equipment and you will leave my property at once," Charlotte commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she hadn't felt in months. The men, seeing the fire in her eyes, did not argue. They began to dismantle their tripod with clumsy, hurried movements. As she sat on her horse, watching to ensure they complied, a flicker of movement on a distant ridge caught her eye. A lone rider, silhouetted against the grey sky. Even from this distance, the figure was unmistakable. The powerful set of the shoulders, the confident seat, the magnificent black stallion. It was Duke Loxley. He was perfectly still, a silent observer watching the entire scene unfold. Was he with them? Was he overseeing Harrington's men, planning how to carve up her home between them? Or was it something else entirely? The image was deeply unsettling. He didn't fit the role of a simple predator, gloating over his prize. He was a watcher, a sentinel, and she could not fathom his purpose. After a long moment, he turned his horse and disappeared over the crest of the ridge, seemingly unaware that he had been seen. Charlotte remained for a long time, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, her world, once a simple black-and-white picture of victim and villain, rapidly dissolving into a confusing, terrifying canvas of grey. Lord Harrington made his unannounced call 2 days later. He arrived in a carriage far too ostentatious for a simple country visit, its lacquered panels gleaming even in the weak afternoon light. Charlotte received him in the main drawing room, where she had deliberately chosen not to light a fire. The room was cold, its grand proportions only serving to amplify the chill, and she hoped it would make her unwelcome guest uncomfortable. It did not. Harrington strode into the room as if he already owned it, his gaze sweeping over the faded tapestries and the bare walls with a proprietary air. He bypassed all pleasantries, his usual veneer of charm stripped away to reveal the raw ambition beneath. "My dear Lady Charlotte," he began, taking a seat without being invited, "I have come to make you an offer, an act of charity, you might say." Charlotte remained standing, her arms crossed. "I am not in need of charity, my lord." "Of course not," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "But you are in need of relief. Allow me to unburden you. I will purchase the entire estate, Blackwood and all its lands. I would pay a handsome sum, you understand, enough to secure a comfortable life for you and your sister in London or Bath. You are too young and refined for these troubles." The offer hung in the cold air, cloaked in false generosity. But in his eagerness, Harrington made a fatal mistake. "Think of it," he purred, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming. "A fresh start, away from these painful memories. Blackwood requires a firm hand and significant investment to realize its full potential. The untapped mineral rights in the eastern hills, the strategic value of the northern pastures for transport. A casual observer would miss these things, but I have always had a keen eye for value." The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The surveyors on the moor, his cloying interest at the ball, the northern pastures, that was where she had seen the men, the very land Loxley had been observing. Harrington's offer wasn't charity, it was a predatory strike. He didn't want to help her, he wanted her land, and he wanted it for reasons he had just foolishly revealed. A cold, clarifying anger washed over Charlotte, displacing the last vestiges of her grief-stricken confusion. Her dislike for this man, for his condescending tone and false sympathy, hardened into a sharp, active distrust. "My family's memories are not for sale, my lord," she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "And you seem to have a remarkably detailed understanding of Blackwood's potential for a man who claims to be motivated by mere sympathy." She walked to the door and pulled it open. "Your visit is over." For a moment, Harrington looked stunned, his mask of civility slipping to reveal a flash of raw fury. He had expected a grateful, broken girl, not this defiant woman who looked at him as if he were something she had scraped from the bottom of her shoe. He rose slowly, his face a thunderous mask. Without another word, he stalked out of the room and out of her house. The encounter left Charlotte feeling violated, as if a thief had just been in her home. But it also left her with something else, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Purpose. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a defender. The sense of being hunted was terrifying, but it had also fully engaged her protective instincts, directing them at a new, more tangible threat than the ghost of her hatred for Duke Loxley. The game had changed, and she was finally beginning to understand the rules. The encounter with Harrington had lit a fire in the cold, desolate chambers of Charlotte's heart. It was a terrifying, clarifying blaze that burned away the fog of her grief and illuminated a new path. A path defined not by passive suffering but by active defense, haunted by the image of the surveyors on the moor, by Harrington's greedy eyes cataloguing her home, and by the unsettling memory of Duke Loxley watching from the ridge. She knew she could no longer afford to be a ghost in her own life. The answers, if they existed, were locked away in one place she had not dared to venture, her father's private study. The room had been kept locked since his death, a silent, dust-shrouded monument to the man he was. The key felt cold and heavy in her hand as she turned the lock. The door swung inward with a low groan, releasing a sigh of trapped air that smelled of old paper, rich leather, and the faint, ghostly aroma of the pipe tobacco her father had favored. It was as if she had stepped back in time. Nothing had been touched. A half-finished letter lay on the blotter, his pen resting beside it as if he had just stepped out for a moment. The silence was profound, heavy with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Forcing down the wave of grief that threatened to overwhelm her, Charlotte began her search. She was not sure what she was looking for, a clue, a name, anything to explain the complex web she now found herself in. She started with the official documents, the neatly bound ledgers and files that chronicled the slow, agonizing death of the Pembroke fortune. It was all there, just as she remembered, a litany of failed investments and mounting debts. There was nothing to suggest foul play, only the tragic story of an honorable man outmaneuvered by a changing world. Hours passed. The weak afternoon light began to fade, and the shadows in the room grew long and distorted. Frustration and despair began to set in. Perhaps she was wrong. Perhaps it was all just as it seemed, a simple tragedy of pride and misfortune. She sank into her father's large leather chair, the worn material creaking in protest. Her hand rested on the edge of the massive mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. As her thumb pressed into a rosette in the knee-hole, she felt a faint click. Her breath caught. She pressed again, harder this time. A section of the drawer facing, disguised as a solid piece of wood, sprang open, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a small, leather-bound book, a private ledger she had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was not for business accounts. The entries were in her father's familiar, elegant script, but they were personal, filled with a growing sense of desperation. She began to read, and the true story of her father's downfall unfolded, a story far darker and more terrible than she had ever imagined. The ledger began with entries full of hope, detailing a series of investments in a South American shipping venture, a venture proposed and facilitated by his trusted friend, Lord Harrington. It spoke of promises of guaranteed returns, of a chance to restore the family's fortunes in a single, brilliant stroke. As she turned the pages, the tone shifted. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. The guaranteed returns never materialized. Instead, there were calls for more capital, explanations of unforeseen delays, and reassurances from Harrington that all was well. Then came the final entries, the script a barely legible scrawl, the ink smudged in places as if by tears of anguish and betrayal. Her father had realized the truth too late. He had been systematically bled dry. The venture was a phantom, a sophisticated fraud engineered by Harrington from the very beginning, designed to fail and leave the Earl indebted to a shadowy group of creditors that Harrington, she now understood, secretly controlled. A single horrifying passage stood out, scrawled across the bottom of the final page. "H has betrayed me," her father had written. "The venture was a phantom. He played me for a fool from the start. My pride, my foolish, damnable pride, has ruined us. He wants Blackwood. I see it now. He has wanted it all along." Charlotte stared at the words, a wave of nausea washing over her. The narrative she had so carefully constructed, the one that had sustained her for a year, the story of an honorable but unlucky gentleman, collapsed into dust. In its place was a far more tragic picture, a portrait of a man consumed by pride and desperation, a man who had been manipulated, broken, and discarded by a man he called a friend. The grief she felt for her father was renewed, a fresh, sharp agony, but now it was mixed with a terrible, clarifying rage, an anger that was no longer a diffuse poison in her heart, but a sharpened blade directed squarely and correctly at Lord Harrington. Her world was reeling, the very ground beneath her feet seeming to shift and tilt. As she numbly closed the ledger, a folded piece of paper, tucked into the back sleeve, slipped out and fluttered onto the desk. It was an unsent letter. Her hands, still shaking from the shock of her discovery, felt clumsy as she picked it up. The address, written in her father's hand, made her blood run cold. It was addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Loxley. Impossible. It was simply impossible. Why would her father, on the brink of ruin, be writing to the very man she believed was his destroyer? Her fingers felt stiff and uncooperative as she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The letter was short, the words cryptic and heavy with a meaning she could not yet grasp. "Loxley," it began, without formal salutation, "if you read this, the wolf is at my door, and I fear I have let him in myself. Remember the debt of honor between our fathers. He means to have Blackwood. Do what I have not the strength to do. Protect my legacy. Protect my girls. Do not let the wolf win." Charlotte read the words once, twice, a third time. They swam before her eyes, refusing to make sense. A debt of honor? Between the Pembrokes and the Loxleys? She had never heard of such a thing. The letter was a plea for help, a desperate, last-ditch appeal. It was an admission of defeat and an act of profound, inexplicable trust, placed in the hands of an enemy. The entire foundation of her worldview, already cracked by the ledger, now crumbled into nothing. The hatred that had been her constant companion, her armor and her fire, was revealed to be a lie, a phantom she had created out of grief and ignorance. She felt dizzy, unmoored from the certainty that had guided her for so long. Who was the wolf? It had to be Harrington. And if Harrington was the wolf, what did that make Loxley? The last pillar of her hatred was shattered, and in its place was a desperate, aching void. A need to understand the truth that was so powerful it felt like it might tear her apart. She could not wait. She could not spend another night in the suffocating grip of this new, terrible uncertainty. She had to find him. She had to have answers. A frantic energy seized her, and she quickly formulated a plan. She knew from the society pages that the Baroness of Ashworth was hosting a small private concert at her London townhouse that very evening. The Baroness was a neutral party, an acquaintance to both families, and Duke Loxley, a known patron of the arts, was almost certain to be in attendance. It was a risk, a flagrant breach of social decorum to appear uninvited, but she no longer cared for such things. Within the hour, she was in her carriage, the precious transcript of her father's letter clutched in her hand, her mind a maelstrom of fear and desperate resolve. She arrived at the Ashworth townhouse and, using the Pembroke name for what might be the last time it carried any weight, managed to gain entry. The house was filled with the soft strains of a string quartet and the low murmur of polite conversation. She scanned the room, her heart pounding, and saw him. He was standing in the archway of the library, listening to the music, his profile outlined against the warm glow of the lamps within. She moved through the crowd, her vision narrowing until he was the only person she could see. She cornered him in the library, away from the prying eyes of the other guests, under the silent, watchful gaze of 1,000 leather-bound books. He turned as she approached, his expression one of mild, aristocratic surprise. "Lady Charlotte," he said, his voice as cool and formal as ever. She was not the same woman who had confronted him at the ball. The fiery, accusatory rage was gone, replaced by a grim, desperate intensity that seemed to radiate from her in waves. She did not waste time on pleasantries. She held out the transcribed copy of her father's letter. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice low and shaking, barely more than a whisper. Edward took the paper, his eyes scanning the few, desperate lines. As he read, for the first time since she had known him, his stoic mask finally cracked. It was not a dramatic change, but a subtle shift, a flicker of old pain and profound weariness that crossed his features before he could suppress it. He looked up at her, his grey eyes shadowed, and she could see a deep reluctance there, a man bound by a strategy he could not yet reveal. "I have spent a year hating you," Charlotte pressed, her voice breaking, the confession torn from her. "I built my life on that hatred because it was all I had left. It was the only thing that made sense. Now I find this." She gestured to the paper in his hand. "I deserve the truth. My father believed you would protect us. Did you?" Her raw vulnerability, the sight of this proud, strong woman so utterly broken and lost, seemed to breach his final defenses. His resolve broke. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound heavy with the weight of a year of silence and deception. "Yes," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she could not name. "I did." He finally confessed the core of the truth, the words tumbling out as if a dam had finally broken. "Your father was right to be afraid of Harrington," he explained, his gaze holding hers. "He sent me a similar, earlier warning, a more direct one. He knew Harrington was circling, that he had been orchestrating his ruin for years. When your father died and his debts were called in, I knew Harrington would use them to seize the estate. He controlled the creditors. It would have been a simple matter for him to foreclose and take everything." He paused, taking a step closer. "So I stepped in first. I went to every creditor, every bank, every private lender. I bought the debt, all of it, and I paid more than I had to ensure no one would challenge the sale. I took control of the property. I made myself the villain of the story. Charlotte. It was the only way to build a legal fortress around Blackwood that Harrington could not breach. To the world, I am a predator who feasted on your family's misfortune. But in the eyes of the law, I am the legitimate owner, and I will never, ever sell to him." The confession washed over her, a sickening, cleansing wave. The public humiliation, the coldness, the seizure of her home, it was all a calculated shield, a lie to protect her from a greater truth. "I could not tell you," Edward said, his voice softening with a deep, aching regret. "To reveal my strategy would be to show my hand to Harrington. He is a dangerous man with powerful friends. Proving his conspiracy without concrete evidence would have been impossible, and it would have put you and your sister in even greater danger. I had to let you hate me. It was the only way to keep you safe." The truth, in its terrible, brilliant simplicity, was devastating. The man she had despised, the man she had publicly denounced, was her silent, unwilling protector. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. She looked at the man before her, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not a cold-hearted vulture, but a brilliant strategist, a man of honor, a man who had sacrificed his own reputation to fulfill a promise to her father. She had misjudged him, so profoundly, so completely, that the shame of it burned her from the inside out. The world had turned on its axis, and she was left standing in the ruins of her own making, filled with a dawning, terrifying respect for the man she had so thoroughly and so wrongly vowed to destroy. They moved from the oppressive silence of the library to a secluded garden path, the night air cold and sharp against Charlotte's heated cheeks. The music from the party was a distant, muffled thrum, a sound from another world. Her world had just been irrevocably shattered and remade. She was reeling, struggling to find her footing on this new, treacherous ground. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, prickling sensation under her skin. Every cruel word she had ever thought, every venomous accusation she had hurled at this man, now echoed in her mind as a testament to her own blind folly. She wrapped her arms around herself, a fragile defense against the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I have misjudged you," she began, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. A thimble of water offered to a man who had crossed a desert for her. "More than I have ever misjudged anyone in my life. I don't know what to say." Her voice was a raw whisper, stripped of all its former fire. Edward stopped beside a stone bench, the moonlight casting his strong features in silver and shadow. His expression, now that she could truly see it, was not one of coldness, but of a deep, abiding weariness. He had carried this burden alone for so long. He accepted her apology not with a triumphant smile or a condescending nod, but with a simple, grave inclination of his head. The quiet dignity of the gesture was almost her undoing. "There was no other way for you to see it," he said, his voice low and steady. "I constructed the narrative myself. Your hatred was a predictable and necessary consequence." He paused, his gaze searching her face. "But now, that must change, and yet, it must also stay the same. Harrington is watching. He is not a fool. He saw your performance at the Hartsworth ball. He believes you are a volatile, passionate woman, consumed by your hatred for me. He must see you as a victim he can manipulate, a broken spirit he can easily crush when the time is right." The cold logic of his words was a stark reminder that the danger was far from over. It had merely changed its shape. "You want me to continue to pretend? To despise you in public?" The thought was abhorrent. "I need you to," he corrected gently. "Our public animosity is now our greatest weapon. It is the one thing that allows me to move against him without his suspicion falling on you. It is our shield, a fragile alliance forged in the shadows of a London garden, bound by a shared enemy and a dead man's plea." Charlotte looked at the Duke, at Edward, and saw the immense personal cost of his strategy. He had willingly sacrificed his name, endured the scorn of society, and borne her relentless hatred, all to honor a promise. A wave of something new, something more potent than respect, began to stir within her. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. "I will do it," she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength. "I will play the part, but I will not be a pawn in this game, Your Grace. I will be a player." For the first time, a genuine, faint smile touched Edward's lips. It transformed his face, chasing away the weariness and revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the ducal mask. "I would expect nothing less, Lady Charlotte," he replied. "Now, your courage is needed for a different fight, a secret one." The air between them was charged with a new, unspoken tension. It was a mixture of her profound guilt, his quiet validation, and a shared, dangerous purpose that hummed between them like a taut wire. They were no longer enemies, but they were not yet friends. They were co-conspirators, and the first rule of their conspiracy was deception. Their investigation began not with a bang, but with a series of whispers and shadows. Their meetings were clandestine, stolen moments of strategy in a world that believed them to be mortal foes. One misty morning, they met as if by accident on the moors, two riders passing on the trail. Under the guise of a strained, formal greeting, Edward shared his primary theory. "Harrington's interest isn't in the paltry mineral rights he mentioned," he murmured, his horse sidling close to hers, their knees almost touching. "He is part of a secret consortium of investors planning a new railway line, a direct route from the industrial heartlands to the coast. If the line goes through Blackwood, the value of that land will increase 100-fold overnight. Your father's estate is the linchpin of the entire scheme." Another time, They found themselves in the same quiet corner of a dusty London bookshop, both ostensibly searching for rare editions. Hidden from view by a towering shelf of theological texts, Charlotte passed him a small, folded note. Lady Danbury mentioned her husband was approached about a speculative transport venture by an associate of Harrington's. Her note read, "He dismissed it as foolish, but the proposed route she described matches the map you drew for me." He read it, his expression unreadable, then slipped her a note of his own. "He's been buying up small, seemingly worthless plots of land for months, all under different company names. It forms a perfect corridor, leading directly to Blackwood's northern pastures." They were piecing together a puzzle, each of them providing different but essential parts. Edward, with his vast resources and influence in the city, followed the money, tracing the labyrinthine web of shell companies and straw buyers. Harrington used to conceal his activities. He was the logistical and financial muscle of their operation. Charlotte, in turn, became his eyes and ears in the drawing rooms and ballrooms of the Tun. Her position as the tragic, ruined Pembroke heiress made her almost invisible, a figure of pity to be ignored. She used this to her advantage, listening with a new, sharp intensity to the idle gossip, the boasts of men who had drunk too much brandy, the careless whispers of wives privy to their husbands' business. She provided the social intelligence, the subtle currents of rumor and speculation that Edward could never access. With each secret meeting, each exchanged note, her perception of him deepened. She saw a new side of Edward Loxley, a man of sharp intellect, meticulous planning, and an unwavering, patient resolve. He was not the cold brute she had imagined, but a brilliant strategist, moving his pieces on a complex board with a skill that she could not help but admire. This admiration, she found, was beginning to feel like something more, something warmer and more dangerous. She would catch his eye across a crowded room, and for a fleeting moment the mask would slip, and she would see a look of shared understanding, of secret camaraderie, that made her heart beat a little faster. The first, subtle sparks of a different kind of fire were emerging from the ashes of her hatred, kindled by their shared goal and the thrilling intimacy of their secret collaboration. The autumn rains began in earnest, turning the world outside Blackwood Manor into a wash of grey and brown. The storms that swept in from the coast seemed to mirror the turmoil in Charlotte's own heart. One particularly wild night, as the wind howled around the eaves and rattled the window frames, a messenger arrived, soaked to the skin, bearing an urgent, sealed note. The handwriting was not Edward's, but the message was clearly from him. It contained only 5 words: "The wolf will check the den." A chill, colder than any draught in the old house, snaked down her spine. Harrington. He was growing impatient. He suspected she was not as broken as she appeared, and he was coming for the one piece of evidence that could expose him, her father's private ledger. The book was her most treasured and dangerous possession, hidden now in a new, more secure location she and Edward had devised. But Harrington wouldn't know that. He would assume it was still in their father's study. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was quickly overshadowed by a fierce, protective anger. This was her home. He would not desecrate it. She would not let him. She summoned the estate's groundskeeper, a man named Mr. Finch, whose loyalty to the Pembroke family was as solid and unyielding as the ancient oaks he tended. He was a large, quiet man, with hands the size of shovels and a steady, reassuring presence. She explained the situation in clipped, concise terms, omitting the details of her alliance with the Duke, but making the nature of the threat perfectly clear. "He will send someone to steal my father's ledger," she finished. "I need your help to catch him." Finch's weathered face, usually placid, hardened into a grim mask. "He'll not lay a hand on anything in this house, my lady," he rumbled, his voice a low growl. "Not while I'm here." Together, they prepared their trap. They left the study unlocked. They even placed a different, unimportant account book in the false bottom drawer, a decoy for the thief. Then they waited. Finch concealed himself in the deep shadows of a heavy velvet curtain, armed with a stout piece of oak that usually served as a door brace. Charlotte waited in the adjoining sitting room. The door cracked just enough to see, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Hours crawled by. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of the rain and the mournful howl of the wind. Then she heard it, a faint scraping noise from the terrace window of the study. A dark figure slipped into the room, a wraith against the stormy night. The man moved quickly, confidently, using a small lantern to illuminate his path directly to the desk. He knelt, his tools making soft metallic clicks as he began to pry at the drawer. The moment he pulled the decoy ledger from its hiding place, Finch emerged from the shadows. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. The thief let out a choked gasp of surprise, but before he could make a sound or a run for it, Finch had him in a grip of iron. Charlotte rushed into the room, her own lantern held high. The thief was a wiry, terrified man with shifty eyes, now wide with panic. He revealed nothing, of course, only stammering that he was paid by an anonymous gentleman in a pub to retrieve an old account book. They tied him up and locked him in the cellar to await the local constable in the morning. The incident, though successful, was a stark reminder of the real danger they were in. This was no longer a game of finance and reputation, of whispers and secrets. It had become physically dangerous. Harrington had violated the sanctity of her home, desecrated the memory of her father. The fear was cold and real, but it was tempered by a surge of gratitude for Edward's warning. He was actively protecting her, watching over her from a distance. The thought sent a tremor of an entirely new emotion through her, a deep and powerful current of trust that solidified their bond more than any secret meeting ever could. The danger had not driven them apart. It had welded their fragile alliance into something hard and unbreakable. To convince Harrington that his victory was not just possible, but imminent, Edward knew they had to escalate their public conflict. The next step in their painful charade was the cruelest yet, a piece of theatre so convincing it would leave no doubt in anyone's mind that Lady Charlotte Pembroke was at the end of her rope. He was going to serve her with a formal notice of eviction. The act felt like a violation, a betrayal of the very trust they had just forged, but they both agreed it was necessary. Harrington had to believe he was about to acquire a broken woman and a deserted estate, not a fortress preparing for battle. The day chosen for the performance was suitably grim. A cold, persistent drizzle fell from a sky the color of slate, slicking the gravel of the drive and dripping from the bare branches of the ancient oaks. Charlotte stood at the window of the drawing-room, watching the approach of a nondescript black carriage. Her heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was harder than she ever could have imagined. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the doors, to hoist a flag of defiance from the battlements and expose the entire lie. But she held the image of Edward's face in her mind, the look of pained resolve in his eyes as they planned this terrible scene. She would not fail him. She would not fail her father. The carriage stopped. A man in a dark suit, Edward's solicitor, emerged, his face a mask of professional regret. And then, in a moment of exquisitely bad timing that felt almost deliberate, another carriage, a garish yellow landau, rounded the bend. It was Lady Beatrice, the county's most notorious and indefatigable gossip. She slowed her horses, her sharp bird-like face craning out the window, her eyes wide with avid curiosity. She was going to witness the entire event, ensuring it would be the talk of every dinner party and tea table from here to London by nightfall. The final nail, as she would no doubt call it, was about to be hammered into the Pembroke coffin, and she had a front-row seat. Charlotte took a deep, shuddering breath and went to play her part. She met the solicitor on the front steps of the manor, refusing to let him cross the threshold. She did not need to feign her pallor. Her skin was already as white as marble. She allowed a tremor to enter her hand as she accepted the thick vellum papers from him, the legal language a blur of meaningless words that amounted to a single, brutal command. Get out. She looked every bit the tragic heroine at the end of her story, her pride finally shattered, her home about to be ripped from her grasp. The humiliation was immense, a physical force that threatened to buckle her knees. She felt the stares of her own servants, peering from the windows, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. She saw the genuine, uncomfortable regret in the solicitor's eyes. "My deepest regrets, Lady Charlotte," he murmured, his voice low and apologetic, just for her to hear. A formality. From the road, Lady Beatrice's voice carried on the damp air, just loud enough to be heard by the solicitor and, Charlotte was sure, by some of the servants. "The final nail in the coffin," she declared to her travelling companion with undisguised relish. "That brute Loxley has no heart at all. To think, he turns them out into the street with winter approaching." Charlotte flinched, the performance suddenly feeling all too real. She wanted to scream, to rage, to tell them all they were fools, that the brute Loxley was the only honourable man in this entire sordid affair. But she held her tongue. She clutched the papers to her chest as if they were a death sentence, and gave the solicitor a single, defeated nod. She turned without a word and retreated into the cold, silent hall of Blackwood Manor, the heavy oak door closing with a sound of absolute finality. Her performance had been flawless, but it had cost her a piece of her soul. She was sacrificing her public honour, the very thing she had once valued above all else, for a greater, secret truth. Edward knew the toll the eviction notice would take on her. He had seen the defiant fire in her eyes, and knew that forcing her to feign defeat would be like asking a lioness to play the part of a lamb. It was a necessary cruelty, but a cruelty nonetheless. That evening, as dusk bled across the sky in bruised shades of purple and grey, he waited for her in a place of secrets and shadows, a neutral and forgotten ground, the ruined abbey on the farthest edge of the Loxley estate. He found her standing in the crumbling nave, the empty stone arches reaching toward the twilight sky like skeletal fingers. The air was still and cold, smelling of damp earth and decaying stone. For a long moment, she simply stood there, a solitary figure outlined against the fading light, her composure finally, utterly broken. The proud, defiant set of her shoulders had vanished, replaced by a slump of exhaustion and grief. He went to her, his footsteps silent on the grassy floor. As he drew near, he saw that her face was wet with tears, the silent, glistening tracks of a pain too deep for sobbing. In that moment, the formal distance between them, the carefully maintained space of Duke and Lady, vanished completely. He was just Edward, and she was just Charlotte, two souls bound together in a dangerous, lonely fight. "I am sorry, Charlotte," he said, his voice rough with a regret that was profound and absolute. "Of all the things I have had to do to see this through," he confessed, his gaze searching her tear-streaked face, "hurting you has been the hardest. Forcing you to endure that humiliation today, it was unconscionable." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering in the gloom. In this moment of shared vulnerability, stripped of their public masks, she offered him the one thing he had never asked for but so desperately deserved: true, verbal forgiveness. "I hated a phantom, Edward," she whispered, the words a balm on his own wounded conscience. "A man I created out of my own grief and anger. The man I see before me now is the man my father trusted. There is nothing to forgive." The use of his name, spoken with such quiet intimacy, was a revelation. The emotional charge between them, which had been simmering beneath the surface of their alliance, became suddenly, undeniably, electric. He had dreamed of this, of her looking at him not with hatred, but with understanding. He reached out, his resolve finally giving way to the longing he had suppressed for so long, and his fingers gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek. The gesture was a spark in the darkness, a touch that conveyed more than words ever could. It was full of unspoken admiration, of shared pain, and of a burgeoning love that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. It was a moment of profound intimacy, a near kiss that hung in the charged air between them. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, and he saw her eyes flutter closed in anticipation. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the heart of the ancient ruin, their love a fragile, secret thing, a single perfect rose blooming in a field of thorns. But he stopped. It was too soon. Their future was still a battlefield, and a kiss now would be a promise he could not yet be sure he could keep. He pulled back, the loss of contact a physical ache. "Your strength, Charlotte," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It humbles me. I thought I was strong, but you endure the public shame while I only manage the finances." She opened her eyes, a flicker of disappointment quickly masked by a renewed strength. "We do what we must," she replied, her voice steady once more. "You taught me that." They both felt it then, the full, undeniable truth of their situation. The alliance, born of necessity and a dead man's honor, had transformed into a deep and powerful love, but it was a love that could not yet be acknowledged, a love trapped by the very conspiracy that had brought them together. The pain of their circumstances was a sharp counterpoint to the beauty of their connection, a bittersweet melody played out in the heart of the crumbling abbey. Their investigation, spurred on by the escalating danger, had led them to a name: Mr. Alistair Finch. He was a former clerk for Lord Harrington, a quiet, unassuming man who had been dismissed without cause nearly a year ago. shortly after he had begun asking too many questions about a series of unusual land acquisitions. Edward's agents had located him living in a modest cottage in a village 20 miles from Blackwood, a man trying to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Edward's initial attempts to get him to talk had failed spectacularly. He had sent an agent with an offer of a substantial sum of money and a promise of protection, but Finch had been terrified, refusing to even open his door, shouting through the wood that he knew nothing and wanted only to be left alone. The man was paralyzed by his fear of Harrington, a fear Edward understood all too well. It was Charlotte who insisted on a different approach. "You cannot buy a man's courage, Edward," she had argued during a hurried, whispered meeting in a crowded marketplace. "But sometimes you can inspire it. Let me speak to him." Reluctantly, Edward had agreed. Now, Charlotte stood before the small, neat cottage, its garden choked with late autumn weeds. She knocked on the door, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. After a long silence, the door opened a crack, and a pair of frightened eyes peered out. "Go away," a trembling voice said. "I have nothing to say to you." "Mr. Finch," Charlotte said, her voice calm and clear, projecting empathy, not threat. "My name is Lady Charlotte Pembroke. I am not here to bribe you or threaten you. I am here because Lord Harrington ruined my father, and I believe he has wronged you as well." There was a long pause. The eyes in the crack of the door widened slightly. Slowly, the door swung open to reveal a thin, balding man with hunched shoulders and a perpetual air of anxiety. He stared at her, his mouth agape. She did not wait for an invitation but stepped inside, forcing him to give ground. The cottage was tidy but threadbare. She approached him not with power, but with shared vulnerability. She told him the story of her own father, of his pride, his trust in a friend, and his ultimate, devastating betrayal. She spoke of the phantom shipping venture, the secret debts, and the slow, agonizing ruin of a good man. Her story, told with raw, unvarnished honesty, resonated with Finch's own sense of being wronged, of being a small, disposable piece in a rich man's cruel game. He saw in her not a grand lady demanding his help, but a fellow victim. And her courage, her refusal to be crushed, gave him a spark of his own. He finally broke. His shoulders, which had been hunched in fear, sagged with the weight of a year of terrified silence. "He is a monster," Finch whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and long, suppressed rage. "He ruins lives and calls it business." He sank into a chair, his face in his hands. Charlotte waited patiently, giving him the space to find his voice. When he finally looked up, his eyes were no longer just frightened. They held a flicker of resolve. He told them everything. He confirmed that Harrington was the architect of a massive railway scheme, that he had used fraud and intimidation to acquire the necessary land, and that he kept a private set of documents, a second ledger, detailing the entire conspiracy, the names of his secret partners in the government, and the fraudulent methods used to ruin men like her father. These papers were the smoking gun they so desperately needed. "I saw them once," Finch said, his voice gaining strength with every word. He was gloating. He thought I was too stupid, too insignificant to understand what I was looking at. A surge of pure, unadulterated hope, the first she had felt in over a year, coursed through Charlotte. "Where, Mr. Finch?" she pressed, leaning forward. "Where does he keep them?" Finch took a deep, shaky breath. "In his London townhouse. In the study. There is a hidden safe, behind the large portrait of his grandfather, the old general." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "He is a man obsessed with power and victory. The combination is the date of the Battle of Waterloo. The information was a key that could unlock everything, a key that could bring a monster to justice and restore her family's honor." The mood, which had been one of patient, painstaking investigation, shifted in an instant to one of imminent, high-stakes action. For the first time since her father's death, Charlotte saw a clear path to victory. The final act was about to begin. The final, most dangerous step of their plan had to be executed in London. Getting Harrington's secret ledger was the key, the single act upon which everything else depended. Edward, whose face was far too recognizable, could not risk being seen anywhere near Harrington's townhouse. The task, by necessity, fell to Charlotte. It was she who devised the plan, a daring piece of social camouflage that was as brilliant as it was perilous. Lord Harrington was hosting a small, formal dinner for a handful of powerful men, but his next door neighbor, a famously flamboyant viscount, was hosting a massive masquerade ball, the most anticipated event of the season. The entire neighborhood, Charlotte reasoned, would be distracted by the music, the lights, and the river of guests. She would use the chaos of the ball as her cover, dressed in an elegant gown of midnight blue silk, her face concealed behind a simple domino mask. Charlotte arrived at the ball on the arm of her sister. Anne, blissfully unaware of the night's true purpose, was giddy with excitement, believing it to be nothing more than a welcome, if mysterious, social outing arranged by their new, secret benefactor. Charlotte played her part, laughing and pointing out amusing costumes, while her mind was a cold, calculating machine, noting the layout of the gardens, the position of the guards, and the timing of the footmen. In a nearby alley, hidden in the deep shadows, Edward waited. He was disguised as a simple carriage driver, his ducal signet ring tucked away, his fine coat replaced with rough wool, his posture slumped into an attitude of bored servitude. He was her escape route, her silent guardian angel, and the knowledge of his presence was a small, steady flame in the icy cavern of her fear. The signal came just after midnight. A spectacular fireworks display, arranged and paid for by Edward, erupted in the sky above the Thames. The guests in the garden all turned their backs to the house, their faces upturned, their oohs and ahs covering any small sound Charlotte might make. This was her moment. With her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she slipped away from Anne's side, melting into the shadows of a sculpted yew hedge. She moved quickly and silently through the Viscount's garden until she reached the low stone wall that separated the two properties. She hoisted her skirts and scrambled over, landing softly on the manicured lawn of Harrington's estate. The contrast was jarring. Behind her was a world of light and noise. Before her, a world of absolute silence and oppressive darkness. She crept across the lawn to the terrace, her silk slippers making no sound on the damp flagstones. Using a key Edward had procured, a copy made from a locksmith's diagram, she unlocked the French doors and slipped inside. The house was dark and utterly still, the air heavy and stagnant. Every creak of the floorboards under her feet sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. The darkness seemed alive with imagined threats, the hulking shapes of furniture transforming into crouching beasts in her peripheral vision. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors by memory, guided by the floor plan Edward had made her memorize. She thought of her father, of his final, desperate letter. She thought of Edward's unwavering faith in her, his willingness to trust her with the culmination of his year-long strategy. This was the ultimate test, not just of her courage, but of her transformation from a bitter, grieving victim into a proactive agent of her own destiny. She would not fail. She found the study. The room was even darker than the rest of the house, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight. A faint, unpleasant smell of stale cigar smoke and old leather hung in the air. She moved by touch, her hands skimming over the cool wood of the desk until she found the wall where the portrait hung. There it was, the imposing image of Harrington's grandfather, his painted eyes seeming to follow her in the dark. She pushed the heavy frame aside, revealing the cold iron face of the safe. Her hands, slick with nervous sweat, shook as she worked the combination dial. The date of the Battle of Waterloo, June 18, 1815. The numbers felt alien under her trembling fingers. She turned the dial right, then left, then right again. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. She tried again, forcing herself to be slow, precise. A soft and metallic click echoed in the silent room, a sound sweeter than any symphony. The heavy door swung open. Inside, just as Finch had said, was a slim portfolio of documents bound in dark red leather. She had them. She had the proof. Clutching the portfolio to her chest, she turned to leave, a wave of triumphant relief washing over her. And then the study door swung open. Lord Harrington stood in the doorway, a single candelabra held aloft in his hand, the flickering light casting his face in demonic shadows. His dinner had ended early. A look of cold reptilian fury, far more terrifying than any shouted rage, settled on his features as he took in the scene. The open safe, the portfolio in her hands, the domino mask that did nothing to hide the identity of the woman who had dared to defy him. "I underestimated you, Lady Charlotte," he said, his voice a low, menacing hiss that dripped with venom. A fatal mistake. He placed the candelabra on the desk and advanced on her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator cornering its prey. Did you really think you could win? A ruined girl with nothing but a misplaced sense of pride? He laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. I will not just ruin you now. I will have you thrown in Newgate as a common thief. I will see your name dragged through so much mud that no one will ever speak it again without a sneer. You will beg me for mercy before I am done with you. He was almost upon her, his hand reaching out to grab the portfolio, to grab her. Charlotte stood her ground, her fear a block of ice in her stomach, but her eyes blazed with a defiance that refused to be extinguished. Just as his fingers were about to close around her arm, the study doors burst open with such force that they slammed against the walls. Edward strode into the room, no longer a disguised coachman, but every inch the powerful Duke, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. Behind him stood two grim-faced men in the uniforms of the Bow Street runners. He had a man watching the house, a failsafe in case the unthinkable happened. When Harrington had returned unexpectedly, his man had run to fetch him. "It is you who has made the fatal mistake, Harrington," Edward's voice rang out, sharp and clear as a clarion call, filled with an authority that stopped Harrington in his tracks. "It's over." Harrington stared, stunned, into silence, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked from Edward's implacable expression to the two officers, and finally to Charlotte, who now stood beside the Duke, no longer a victim but a victor. With a steady hand, she presented the red leather portfolio to the senior officer. "I believe you will find all the proof you need right there, sir," Edward said, his voice ringing with triumph. "Conspiracy, fraud, and theft on a grand scale." The officer opened the portfolio. A quick glance at the top document, an illegal contract bearing the forged signature of a government minister, was all he needed. Harrington began to sputter, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. "You have no proof. This is an outrage, a fabrication. I am a peer of the realm." His protests were cut short as the officers moved in, each taking an arm in a firm, unyielding grip. His empire of deceit, built on the ruins of honorable men, had crumbled to dust in a single, dramatic moment. As they led him away, still shouting threats and denials, his eyes met Charlotte's one last time. In them, she saw not just hatred, but the dawning, terrified realization that he had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and utterly defeated. A wave of immense, shuddering relief washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She looked at Edward, at her protector, her ally, her silent champion, and knew, with absolute certainty, that the long, dark night was finally over. A few weeks later, sunlight, brilliant and unapologetic, streamed through the newly cleaned windows of the Blackwood Manor drawing room. A fire roared in the hearth, its cheerful crackle a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive silence that had filled the house for so long. The faded grandeur was beginning to recede, replaced by the first tentative signs of restoration and hope. With Harrington's conspiracy exposed, his powerful partners implicated and his assets seized, the Pembroke name was not just cleared, it was celebrated. The story of the brave lady who had risked everything to expose a villain, and the noble Duke who had secretly protected her, had become the stuff of legend, a tale of honor and courage that was whispered in every drawing room in London. Charlotte was arranging a bouquet of late, blooming roses when the butler announced the arrival of Duke Loxley. He entered the room not as its owner, but as a guest, his presence no longer a source of dread, but of a quiet, profound joy. He looked different here, in the light, filled room, more relaxed. The lines of weariness around his eyes softened. He came to her, and in his hands he held a legal document, tied with a simple blue ribbon. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice soft. She took it, her fingers brushing his. It was the deed to Blackwood Manor, free and clear of all debt. The title legally and irrevocably returned to Lady Charlotte Pembroke. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow but of a joy so immense it was painful. She had her home back. She had her honor back. "I don't know how to thank you, Edward," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There is no need for thanks," he replied, his gaze warm and intense. "With the battle won, the danger past. The wall of Saintes the precious.